You've seen the news. I know you have. Trump faces jail. Congress drops new impeachment articles. Sounds like the loudest, most dramatic moment in American politics, doesn't it? But here's the deal. If you look past those flashy graphics and the breaking banners, what's actually happening is far more specific and in many ways more unsettling. We have two very different branches of government, the Congress and the courts, using two very different powerful tools against the same president at roughly the same time. The real story, the one that impacts every single one of us, is about how those tools work and what it takes for our institutions to finally decide that a president has truly crossed a line. Let me lay out the basic facts for you so we're all on the same page. In the House of Representatives, a Democrat from Michigan, Representative Sri Thandanar, has introduced a formal impeachment resolution against Donald Trump. This isn't a tweet. It's not a press conference. It's House Resolution 3533, filed in late April of this year, an actual impeachment resolution that now lives in the official congressional record. It contains 7 separate articles, each one laying out a category of alleged misconduct: obstruction of justice, breach of the duty to faithfully execute the laws, seizing the power of the purse from Congress, abusing trade and war-related powers, violating First Amendment rights, creating an unlawful office, engaging in bribery and corruption, and finally a charge that uses a word not thrown around lightly in constitutional law: tyranny. That's a heavy word, folks. It means something. At the very same time, down the street in a federal courtroom in Washington, a very different kind of process is underway. A district judge, James Boasberg, has issued a ruling, and this ruling found that there is probable cause to hold Trump administration officials in criminal contempt of court. Why? For disobeying his direct order in an immigration case involving vulnerable Venezuelan migrants. Judge Boasberg had ordered the government to halt certain deportations, even to turn planes around. But the administration, they allowed those flights to go through anyway. In his opinion, the judge described what he saw as willful disregard of his order, and he laid out a path that could lead to contempt findings, significant fines, and yes, in an extreme scenario, even jail time for officials who continue to defy the court. So when you hear that Donald Trump is facing impeachment and jail in the same news cycle, that's the convergence we're talking about. On one side, Congress is being asked to say that the president has committed high crimes and misdemeanors and should be removed from office. On the other, judges are signaling that if the administration keeps ignoring court orders, they are absolutely prepared to use their contempt powers. Now, these are very different tools. Impeachment is a political and constitutional process that ultimately runs through our elected lawmakers. Contempt is a legal enforcement tool that runs through judges and, depending on the type, sometimes through prosecutors. But if you're the president at the center of all this, you can bet it feels like the walls are closing in at the same time. You might be watching this thinking, has the House actually impeached Trump again? Or is this just one member of Congress making a statement? Or does the contempt finding mean the president himself could be marched off to jail? Or are we mostly talking about cabinet officials and agency heads? And more basically, how real is all of this versus how much is just symbolic pressure in a very polarized environment where everyone is always threatening some kind of escalation? It's my job to walk you through where that line is between what's symbolic and what's real, between what's likely and what's technically possible, but still a long way off. The first thing you need to understand, folks, is that an impeachment resolution like the one Representative Thandanar filed is the beginning of a process, not the end. He drafted and introduced this document, and he used a procedural device known as a privilege resolution. In practical terms, what that means is he's trying to force the House to deal with it. Under House rules, a privilege impeachment resolution cannot simply be buried forever by leadership. At some point, the majority has to decide whether to vote on it directly, refer it to the Judiciary Committee, table it, or take some other formal action on the floor. Thandanar has already filed notice of his intent to offer the resolution as privilege, which starts a kind of countdown and limits how long leaders can avoid the question. Now, this doesn't mean removal is just around the corner, not by a long shot. For a president to be removed, the House would first have to adopt articles of impeachment by a simple majority, and then the Senate would have to hold a trial and vote to convict by a 2/3 margin. We are nowhere near that stage. Right now, we are in the phase where one member from the president's opposition party is trying to force his colleagues to say in public whether they are willing to move forward. If you feel like you've seen this movie before in the Trump era, you're not wrong. Individual lawmakers have occasionally introduced impeachment resolutions as a way to mark a position to please a primary electorate or to pressure leadership. What's different here, though, is the sheer breadth of the articles and the explicit use of that word tyranny. It's designed to frame this as a systemic threat, not just a dispute over one policy or one scandal. This is about something deeper. Before I get to the scary part, hit that subscribe button. It helps us fight back and make sure more people understand what's truly at stake. On the judicial side, that contempt story has its own stages and thresholds.
A federal judge saying there's probable cause to find contempt is not the same as someone already being in handcuffs. It's closer to a warning shot backed by serious legal findings.
In this case, Judge Boasberg has given the administration a deadline to cure the violation by asserting custody over the migrants who were deported in defiance of his order, or by identifying the officials responsible. If the administration refuses, he can move from probable cause to actual contempt findings. Those can take the form of civil contempt, which is meant to coerce compliance through daily fines or other penalties, or criminal contempt, which is punitive and can involve fixed jail sentences. Historically, courts have been very reluctant to send federal officials to jail for contempt in disputes over policy and appeals. Courts often step in, but the power exists, and the current rulings are explicit about that possibility. This isn't just legal theory, folks. This is a judge telling the executive branch, you ignored my order on Venezuelan migrants. You have a chance to fix it, or there will be consequences. What ties these two tracks together, what makes this more than just two separate news stories, is not simply the name Trump. It's a deeper, more fundamental argument over whether the president and the people around him truly see themselves as bound by the same constraints that applied to earlier administrations, to presidents of both parties for decades. The impeachment articles in House Resolution 353 describe a pattern in which the White House reaches beyond its legal authority, especially in areas like spending and war powers, and treats Congress as an obstacle to be bypassed rather than a co-equal branch of government. They allege a systematic undermining of the constitutional balance. And the contempt rulings like Judge Boasberg's describe a pattern in which court orders are treated as optional, something to be worked around with creative timing or legal technicalities rather than followed in good faith. You may agree or disagree with that framing, but that is the picture being painted by members of Congress and by federal judges, each in their own language, each in their own branch. This matters for your family, folks. When the executive branch decides that court orders are negotiable, it changes how government policy shows up in your world. Maybe you're an asylum seeker who thought a judge had protected you from being deported, and then you find out the plane took off anyway. Or maybe you live in a community where federal money is supposed to be spent one way because Congress wrote it into law, only to see the White House redirect those funds for a different project that happens to be politically popular. These fights can sound abstract, but they determine whether the rules that are written down actually govern what happens on the ground in your town, in your life. Inside the system, both Congress and the courts have limited tools to respond.
Lawmakers can hold hearings, cut budgets, slow down confirmations, and in the extreme move toward impeachment. Judges can issue narrower or broader orders, impose deadlines, and if they believe they are being ignored, invoke contempt.
None of these tools are cost-free. Every escalation risks looking partisan. Every contempt finding risks creating a standoff that higher courts might overturn.
That's why you've seen so many officials over the years swallow their frustration and hope that quiet negotiations will bring agencies back into line.
The fact that we are now seeing impeachment resolutions citing tyranny and judicial opinions talking openly about contempt tells you that in some corners that patience is simply wearing out. Here's the hidden truth. The part that often gets lost in the daily rush of headlines. What you see on your screen, Trump faces jail or Congress moves to impeach, as if these are single decisive moments. In reality, each of those phrases compresses months of hearings, of drafting, of court filings, internal debates, and strategic calculations. If you only see the end result, it can feel like the system is lurching from one extreme crisis to the next. But if you look underneath, you see something slightly different and maybe even more troubling. You see institutions that are slowly, painstakingly adjusting to a president who tests boundaries again and again. And you see officials, career professionals, deciding one by one how far they are willing to go to push back, to defend the Constitution. One reason this moment feels so confusing is that for a lot of people, this is not the first time they've heard the word impeachment next to the name Trump. If you lived through the earlier impeachment fights, you might feel like this is just another rerun of the same show. But the institutional story here is a little different. Earlier impeachments were built around specific episodes and investigations that leadership shepherded through committees, hearings, and formal inquiries. What's happening now with House Resolution 353 started with a backbench member, Representative Vanadar, forcing the issue from below, using House rules that let any lawmaker file a privileged resolution and dare their colleagues to look away. That difference matters because it tells you something about where the energy in politics is coming from and how much control leadership really has over these escalations. Impeachment itself is a blunt instrument. Yes, it is. But inside the building, it's also a powerful messaging device and a kind of test. When a member files an impeachment resolution like this, they're not just speaking to the White House or to viewers like you, they are speaking directly to their own caucus. They are asking fellow Democrats whether they are willing to sign their names to allegations that go beyond a single scandal and into accusations like usurping Congress or engaging in tyranny. In a polarized environment, there is constant pressure on lawmakers to show that they are not soft on a president their base dislikes. At the same time, leadership worries that moving too far, too fast, makes it easier for Republicans and some independents to dismiss the whole thing as just noise, as partisan political theater. That's the tension behind closed doors right now. Do they treat this resolution as a serious vehicle and risk a backlash, or do they swat it away and risk angering their own voters who want to see harder lines drawn? Folks, the truth is protecting our democracy is something we all have to take seriously. Every decision made in the highest offices affects our future, and it's up to us to stay informed and hold those in power accountable. By becoming a member of this channel, you're not just supporting this work. You're joining a community committed to shining a light on the truth and defending the institutions that keep our nation strong. Stand with us. Help expose what's happening and make sure your voice is part of the fight for the America we believe in. On the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue, you have judges like Judge Boasberg who are not thinking about primary voters or cable news segments. They're thinking about compliance rates and precedents. When a judge issues an order in an immigration case like the one involving Venezuelan migrants and the government openly fails to follow it, that is not just one policy disagreement. It is a data point in how much the executive branch still respects the courts as an equal partner. If you zoom out, you see a pattern that predates Trump. Presidents of both parties, myself included, have pushed the boundaries of executive power in national security, immigration, and spending. What is new in this era and what has so many judges putting strong language into their opinions is the sense that defiance is not an exception but a strategy. It's the idea that you can get caught violating an order, pay a political or legal cost later, and in the meantime continue to show your base that you will not let unelected judges tell you what to do. That is a dangerous, dangerous mindset for a democracy. When you step back from the daily rush of headlines, what becomes clear is that we are watching a clash between two very different theories of presidential power. One theory, the traditional one, the one I believe in, sees the presidency as an office constrained by Congress, by the courts, and by norms built up over decades. The other, which Donald Trump embraces more openly than any modern president, sees those constraints as negotiable, temporary, or even illegitimate. And the impeachment articles now on the table, alongside the contempt warnings from federal judges, represent the system trying to answer a question it has rarely been forced to confront so directly. What happens when a president refuses to accept the limits of the office? To understand how we got here, it helps to look at the mechanics of defiance. In most administrations, even when officials disagree with a ruling, they comply with court orders because noncompliance is considered both legally dangerous and institutionally taboo. The idea that an agency might simply refuse to follow an injunction would normally send shockwaves through Washington. Under Trump, however, defiance became almost a form of messaging, a way to show that the president was willing to fight the system. Each time the administration pushed back against a ruling, whether on immigration, environmental regulations, or spending, it reinforced a narrative that the courts were obstacles, not partners in governance. What judges are responding to now is not just a single violation, but a pattern. When Judge Boasberg says there is probable cause to hold officials in contempt, he is not only addressing one deportation flight, he is responding to the broader impression that the executive branch under Trump sees judicial orders as suggestions rather than commands. Judges are generally cautious institutions, folks. They prefer persuasion to punishment, clarity to conflict. So when they start invoking contempt, you are seeing the equivalent of an alarm bell inside the judiciary. It means they believe the normal tools of accountability are simply not enough. At the same time, Congress is engaging in its own form of pattern recognition. The 7 impeachment articles in House Resolution 353
do not center on a single scandal, but on what lawmakers argue is a systemic approach to governing, bypassing congressional authority, undermining constitutional protections,
weaponizing executive power, and in that most dramatic framing, signaling an intent toward tyranny. These articles are not written as a reaction to a new event, but as an accumulation of past ones. What lawmakers are saying, in effect, is that the country is not dealing with discrete misconduct, but with a philosophy of governance incompatible with the Constitution itself. If you think about impeachment as a kind of constitutional storytelling, the narrative being told here is unusually sweeping. Typically, impeachment articles focus on specific provable episodes, a break-in, a phone call, an obstruction act. Here, the House sponsor is building a case that the presidency itself, the shape of it, the boundaries of it, has been reshaped in ways that threaten the democratic structure. It is a claim not only about what Trump has done, but about where he is trying to take the country, to take us all. The intersection of impeachment and contempt is where this all becomes more volatile. Each branch is acting in its own domain, but the political effect is cumulative. You have Congress formally questioning the president's legitimacy, while judges are formally questioning the administration's obedience to the rule of law. These two tracks do not coordinate with each other, yet they reinforce the same underlying concern that the executive branch has drifted away from constitutional accountability.
This raises an uncomfortable but important question, one that political scientists and constitutional lawyers have debated for years.
What does the Constitution allow you to do when a president simply rejects constraints? The founders envisioned the impeachment power as a safeguard, but they also imagined presidents would fear impeachment enough to modify their behavior. What happens when the threat of impeachment is not enough? Courts imagined that contempt powers would enforce compliance, but they also imagined officials would comply long before the possibility of jail time became real. Both sets of assumptions are being tested right now. Both branches are discovering the limits of tools that were designed for an era where presidents operated within a shared understanding of constitutional boundaries. And that recognition that the old assumptions may no longer hold is why the language is escalated. When you hear judges talking about contempt and lawmakers talking about tyranny, they are signaling that the normal vocabulary of interbranch disagreement no longer feels adequate. But here's the part often missed in all the political noise. Neither branch actually wants a showdown. Congress does not want to end up in a situation where impeachment becomes routine or ineffective. Judges do not want to be in the business of jailing executive branch officials. These are last resort tools in a system that assumes good faith from the presidency. The very fact that they are even being discussed as realistic options shows how far the conflict has drifted from normal constitutional politics. And yet this is exactly the scenario the Constitution was designed to handle.
A presidency that the other branches believe has overstepped, and institutions forced to test whether the guardrails are still strong enough to bring it back into line. The stakes are not just about Donald Trump.
They are about whether the system still functions when the presidency refuses to play by the traditional rules. What happens inside the White House and inside the parties when these pressures converge? That's where the rubber meets the road. How do political actors decide whether to escalate, negotiate, or break from the president? When pressure builds from Congress and the courts at the same time, the question becomes not just what happens to the president, but what happens around him. Administrations don't usually collapse because of a single legal blow. They unravel because the people inside them begin making calculations about risk, loyalty, and survival. And that is where the convergence of impeachment and judicial contempt becomes more than symbolic. It forces every actor connected to the presidency to choose a path. Inside any White House facing existential pressure, the atmosphere narrows. Decision-making becomes more centralized. Legal counsel warns that continuing to push boundaries could put staff at personal risk. Political advisors warn that retreating could alienate the base. Cabinet officials, many of whom are simultaneously political appointees and legal officers, begin to ask questions they never expected to face. Am I willing to be held in contempt of court? Am I willing to sign my name to an action Congress is labeling tyrannical? How far am I prepared to go for this president? This is where the system's pressure points become visible. You start to see leaks from within the administration, not because people suddenly grow more talkative, but because they are signaling discomfort, testing how much responsibility they will be expected to carry. Some officials lawyer up, others quietly distance themselves from controversial decisions. A few consider resigning, not out of protest, but simply because they see no safe path forward. The presidency may be one person, but governing requires an entire apparatus. When that apparatus begins to wobble, the consequences show up fast. Meanwhile, the political parties surrounding the presidency run their own calculations. For Republicans, the question is brutally simple. How much political cost are they willing to bear on behalf of a president facing both impeachment articles and judicial threats publicly they may rally? Privately, they worry about suburban voters, independents, and donor blocs who are sensitive to constitutional crises. Even members who fully support the president's agenda can feel uneasy about standing behind behavior judges described as defiance of the rule of law. For Democrats, escalation carries its own risks. Impeachment is the most serious tool in Congress's arsenal, and the farther they push it, the more they risk being accused of overreach. But when lawmakers use words like tyranny in official filings, they are also making a long-term bet that history will judge these actions not as partisan theater, but as necessary guardrails. In a moment like this, both parties are gambling. One on loyalty, the other on institutional responsibility, without knowing which narrative will resonate with voters in the country. The public, folks, ends up living through the consequences, whether they want to or not. Constitutional crises don't stay inside the Capitol or the courtroom. No, they filter into elections, markets, international relations, and everyday civic trust. When people see two branches of government openly challenging a sitting president's legitimacy, it erodes faith not only in that president, but in the ability of the system itself to function without spiraling into dysfunction or chaos. This is the part that often gets lost in the drama. The Constitution doesn't enforce itself. It relies on people, elected officials, judges, agency heads, and yes, you, the voters, to decide when enough is enough. And moments like this test not just one leader, but the entire structure around that leader. Impeachment resolutions don't move unless lawmakers choose to move them. Contempt proceedings don't escalate unless judges decide they must. Political crises don't resolve unless institutions still believe they have a responsibility to act. As for Donald Trump, the convergence of impeachment articles and judicial contempt warnings places him in a tightening vice, not because removal or jail are guaranteed, but because both paths remain open. A president can fight a political battle or a legal battle, but fighting both at once requires political capital and discipline that few administrations possess. When Congress questions your fitness for office and judges question your compliance with the law, you are no longer just managing scandals. You are managing a legitimacy crisis. And that is where we end this topic. Not with a prediction, not with a dramatic finish, but with a recognition that the real story is still unfolding inside the institutions themselves. The guardrails of American democracy are being tested in real time right now. Whether they hold depends less on any single headline and more on the willingness of Congress, the courts, and the public to enforce the boundaries that make a constitutional system possible. The chapter ahead, whatever it looks like in the coming weeks and months, will tell us as much about the strength of those institutions as it will about the president at the center of the storm. Stay engaged, folks. Your voice matters. Comment below and let me know what you